So in Lascaux, it wasn't like you went to the entry of the cave and you looked up and there was a bunch of really cool paintings, right? If you've ever been to the American Southwest, a lot of time we have pictographs and these ancient paintings on the wall, and they're like just carved on the wall, or you enter the cave and they're carved in the cave. But these things were actually deep, dark into the cave. So these caves were really, really deep. So like some of them, like this one in particular, was like 2 or 3 football fields deep, right? So it goes into the earth a lot, right? And this cave is placed on top of a hill, right? And so if you were a hunter and gatherer, I want you to think about this. You're a hunter and gatherer. Life is really, really hard, right? You would go in this valley on the top of a hill, and you'd see this entryway into a cave, right? You'd see this entryway into a cave, and then you'd kind of go into it. It would just get dark and dark and dark and dark and dark. Has anyone been to a cave? Anyone gone spelunking? Spelunkers? Any spelunkers? I've been to Mammoth Cave. I've been to a lot of caves in the United States, especially as a child. They're cold, they're dark. They're not places you really want to hang out and spend a lot of time. And in Lascaux in particular, there was like an entryway, and it was really, really small and narrow. And then it started to open up into small, like other larger rooms. And so the Hall of Bulls, where our painting is from, is in one of the larger entryways to the cave. And you can't go there today because human pollution was deteriorating the paintings. But they had a modern entryway, and that's what you see here on this image. This is the modern entryway, but the other entryway would have been much more small and kind of difficult to get through. And so ancient man, prehistoric man, I should say, prehistoric man is going through considerable effort to climb a hill, to get into a cave, and then to go deep, dark into the cave to then actually paint these inside these caves, okay? And so Lascaux is probably one of the oldest caves that we've found so far. It's over 17,000 years old. And we're lucky that the caves paintings lasted as long as they did, because unlike most caves, which are dark and damp, it actually has white calcite, which is a non-porous rock, which actually makes it a little bit drier than typical caves, which allowed for this art to stay over the millennium. And like I said, this was a really, really narrow sort of passage to get in here. And then the cave that we're talking about in particular was much bigger opening. And so they have figured out a lot about these caves by doing archaeological digs inside of them. They've found things like primitive lamps. So they would have burned like fat from animals to make candles, or to kind of burn natural shrubbery, or like torches, that sort of thing. They found remnants of it in the ground, like buried. And then also they think that they might have played music in there, because they found parts of what they think are musical instruments. And of course, in a chamber like this, it probably has awesome acoustics. So let's go ahead and look at the content of this. And so this is the part where I'm going to let you guys do a little bit of talking here. What imagery is represented, right? So what imagery is represented here? What do we see?
Well, I think the brown animal might be some type of lion or a part of the lion family, because it has a mane and a longer tail. And that
Yeah,
way,
I
more
could
of
see how you think that, because that does look like kind of like a lion's like head. But I don't actually think, even though there was different animals in France than what there is today, I actually don't think it's a lion. Does anyone have another educated guess of what that might be? What might this be? I'm sorry. Can you repeat? I thought I heard something. It could be a horse, right? And so, sorry. It could be a horse, right? It could be some sort of deer. And if you look really carefully, we've got another animal that's behind that horse, right? What is this? What is this big thing on the right? Can you guys hear me?
Is it a rhino?
It isn't a rhino. I'll actually see a rhino later. This is like a bison, right? It's some sort of bovine, right? Kind of looks like cattle in a way, right? And then these smaller things at the base look an awful lot like horses. And then on both sides, can you see this small guy here? What does this guy look like on the right that I'm circling with my cursor? Can you see me circling my cursor?
Yeah, it looks like elks.
Elks, right? Or deer. And then there's some other sort of animal over here that has horns as well, right? And so oh my goodness, right? So this is horses and mostly bulls, but there are some deer or antelope as well. And what you're going to notice is that they chose to emphasize certain parts of the animal. So the torso is really emphasized. It's big and it's like beefy, like it's meaty, right? And then also the horns are kind of really large and exaggerated. And if you think about what these people's lives were like, right? They were hunters and gatherers. This is probably the most important part of the animal. Think about it, right? The horns, right? What would you use the horns for? What could you use horns for from animals?
To make tools?
Make tools, exactly. You could use them to make tools. You could use them to make weapons, right? And then, of course, the body of the animal you could use for food, right? You could use it for food. You can use the hides for clothing, for shelter, that sort of thing. And those are the things that are typically emphasized in cave paintings. A lot of times in cave art, the work is in profile, right? So we see part of the head, the big part of the body. And of course, that would be the most recognizable view. And it would be the view that kind of emphasizes the most important parts of the animal. But it's interesting that sometimes the horns look like they're like a 3/4 or a front view, because it would be hard to understand a horn if you just saw one, right? Because if it was in profile, it would just look like one in front of the other. And so sometimes they have what we call twisted perspective. And that's where you see more than one view at the same time. A good example of that would be Egyptian art, right? Where they have a frontal face and the shoulders are they have a profile face and their shoulders are in frontal and then their legs are back in profile. So it's kind of like when you see multiple views at the same time. But when we look at this slide, we can see that this little section of the painting, right, is not the entire Hall of Caves. You can see by looking at this one at the very bottom here, that this was painted on the ceiling, right? And there's much more bulls. So the bulls are really emphasized in this second image. I'm not quite sure why they picked the one on top as their image, but AP does those kinds of things, right? So if we were going to look at form, right? Form is how it's created, not what it actually is. How would you say, what would you say is the style beside it being in twisted perspective? Think about line, shape, color. What do you think? How is it drawn out? I know it's Monday or it's Tuesday after a holiday, but I really want you guys to participate because you're never going to get through the content if I have to wait for dead air. And I will, right? Because I can't do all the talking. How are they represented?
The proportions aren't really to scale.
No, the proportions are all over the place, right? Some of the animals are gigantic and some of them are small. Some of them look like background and then sometimes they're small, but they look like they're in the foreground. So like the proportion is totally off. And we can talk about that in a second. Are they shaded? Do they look super realistic? Are they super realistic? Like if you saw an animal that looked like just like this bull right here, walking down the street, would it look perfectly normal to you? I think it looks like an outline, right? This one on the right here, or the bull that's actually in our image set, is just an outline. And then some of the other animals are in silhouette, they're just filled in flat, right? There's very, very little shading. I sort of look at like here, like this horse in the center might have a little bit of shading underneath his belly and a little bit at the top, but that's not very characteristic of this style, right? Normally it's very flat and very linear, right? So they would have been painted with natural materials. So they would have used the same materials that we saw in Africa, ochres, charcoals, right? And they would have used primitive tools like a paintbrush made out of animal hair or human hair. The pigment would have been attached to the wall with maybe things like animal fat or even things like human saliva. You could mix these things with human saliva in order to apply them on the wall, right? And one of the major reasons for things being different sizes and different scales is that they were probably made by different artists, right? Over different time periods. So people would go back and into these caves and paint for different like millennium even. So over thousands of years, they were painting different images inside these caves based on the different animals that were migrating in the river valley that this is located in. Right? So thinking about what we just talked about, they're not super realistic. So the cartoon I started with today is a good example of that. In many other caves and other locations, we have lots of other animals as well. Most of the time they're animals. There are some human-like creatures as well, all right? So a little bit of context. Inside the Hall of Bulls, it actually I believe is like 17 feet tall in size for this ceiling. And so a lot of times people are like, how the heck did these people go up into this cave? They would have made some scaffolding. And we know this because there was some remnants found in the ground, but also there were little holes in the wall that didn't seem to be naturally made. And so archaeologists believe that those were holes that held the scaffolding in place so that they could paint the ceilings, right? So that kind of leads me to think about something else. If you were a hunter and gatherer, right? If you were a hunter and gatherer, so it was really, really tough to live. The fact that you built scaffolding, that you would climb into a cave that was narrow and dark and cold, and it might take you, an hour to like climb into a particular area. You have to think that this would have been really important to these people, right? This is not just a passing pastime for them. This would have been something that was considerably important for them to do for various reasons, right? So let's focus on that. What were the intended purposes of these cave paintings? Why were they painted? Anyone know? Any ideas from their notes? Why were these painted?
Maybe to show the how the animals behave and stuff for future hunter and gatherers.
Right, so they could be depicting what they see in their environment, right? So depicting what they see in their environment, they could be telling stories about like the time and place. So thinking about how there's different animals on the wall and these different migrating animals, like let's say at 25,000 years ago, there was a lot of bison. And then at 24,000 years ago, that's when then there was more deer. And then at 22, there was more horses. And so it would have maybe told us some information about what kind of animals were migrating in this region during a particular time. What else?
Maybe like the, you can go, Brianna.
Go ahead, Cora.
Okay. Maybe like we said with the Apollo 11, it could be some sort of like, they thought maybe if they painted the animals, it'd help them like hunt them or catch them.
Right. And it's really kind of cool because there are little like marks on some of the animals. And when I say this, it doesn't necessarily apply to just this painting, but all the other cave paintings that they found as well. There's these little chip marks. And so then when they did excavations of the floor, they found things like arrows and other sharp objects. And so they could have been like ceremonially killing, so like shooting arrows at the wall to like ceremonially kill the spirit of the animal, which would have made it maybe easier to hunt, right? Any other educated guesses? Okay, so this is all speculation, remembering that our theme is cave conjecture. We don't know any of this for a fact. We just have some evidence. So the first speculation is what we were just talking about, is this idea of hunting magic. They could have been painted to make the hunt much more successful. And we know a lot of this because of finding those little arrows, finding nicks in the wall, and so on. Another thing is what Aaron was saying, is it kind of tells us a narrative. It tells us a story. It tells us some history. So we know what animals were there in different time periods. This second image on the bottom, which is often called the Birdman image, is not in the 250, but it's kind of an odd image, but it actually has a humanoid, and I call it a humanoid because it has a bird head. So it's kind of odd that it has it, but it could be telling us a story as well, or it even could be depicting some sort of spiritual story. So it could be communicating fact or like religious beliefs. And so like this image that we were just talking about here with the Birdman, it has a hairy bison, and then it also has a rhinoceros on the side as well. A lot of people believe that this bird-like creature could be a shaman. He has a staff with another bird on the end of it. So that's one plausible that this is part of their religious belief. Other people believe that it possibly is connected to the study of the stars, because in this painting in particular, parts of the outline and the eyes of the bull, Birdman, and bird represent three prominent stars of Vega, Deneb, and Altar, excuse me. So I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. So it's also possible that it was all about cosmology and the reading of the stars. I still think that this kind of cosmology still represents a sense of fertility. And so to kind of explain that, I want you to think about this, a cave, right? It is an opening inside the earth, right? So it's kind of like a symbol of a womb of the earth, right? So like the female womb that carries life, a cave could have been viewed as a kind of a magical place where fertility of animals comes from. And stars, pardon me, could represent things like sperm, right? It could represent the things that fertilize the cave. And so there could be connections there as well. So a lot of historians believe that the caves were that the cave paintings were protected, right, in these caves. They were hidden and far beyond their living quarters, right? They were made to last. So these were not passing fancies. These are not things that were supposed to be temporary. They kept and added to them for different millennium, right? They were in the inner part of the cave, which represents the womb of the earth, which could symbolize fertility or protection, right? And we know that these places were super important to them because they kept returning to them, right? If it was not important to them, they would have forgot about it and not gone back and painting. So it would have been passed down throughout the generations. Okay. I wanted to show, excuse me. I have a video that somehow I skipped. Like, let me see where it is. There we go. I'm just going to show you. If you went to Lascaux today, and I guess I should see, has anyone been to Lascaux? A lot of us are world travelers. So but today they recreated it. So you don't actually get to go into the actual caves. You only get to go into this fake cave, but it's very realistic. And so they have a really good video that kind of shows you the government of France, what it would be like to enter these caves. So I just want to kind of show you a little bit of the conditions in which they were painted. So you can see how massive some of these animals are and how abundant, right? The surfaces wouldn't have been flat. It would have been difficult to paint. So once again, emphasizing the importance that it would have been to these people. You see one animal's upside down, so maybe it's dead. You see some of the passages are quite narrow and small. Be difficult to get through that. Okay, this second website that I have here at the bottom is all in French, but it has a lot of, like, you can do close-ups of the different parts of the cave. Let's just zip through. I want to show you some other cave paintings from this region. Right, this is often called, I think this one is not politically correct. I think they call it the Chinese horse because it is reminiscent of Chinese painting. Part of that linear sort of quality and sort of like the hazy effect that you see on the brown and in the mane of the horse. Here is at Chavray in France, and you can see all this abundant differences of horses heads here and rhinoceroses and bison, right? So it kind of shows about all the different animals that would have lived in Europe of the day. And then it wasn't necessarily necessary to paint the entire animal, just like the essence of the animal. This one also shows a little bit more realism. One thing I should mention is that these painters were painting all of these animals from memory, right? It's not like they would bring an animal into the cave and paint it realistically. Be dark, be difficult to paint in such circumstances. There's a close-up. Here's some rhinoceroses fighting, and I believe this is the one that, if you look really carefully, you can see the surface of the wall is all scratched up and part of this kind of ceremonial killing. This kind of tells us a little bit about the methods of how they were painted. If you pay close attention, you can see human hands. And so what they would do is put the pigment in their mouth, and they would use their mouth as an airbrush and blow the pigment sometimes onto the wall. And that's why it's kind of hazy. It almost looks like spray paint. Other caves, this is in Altamira in Spain. Sometimes they would see the animal on the wall. So this cave has kind of this bumpy sort of surface, and they painted bison in the bumps. It's like they saw the animal in the crevice or the crack, or they saw the animal in the natural occurrence of the cave, and that would make it seem magical, right? Here's some bison that were carved out of the earth. So sometimes they're 3D. Right? Here's a good example of an animal that was carved out of a crack. So they probably saw the profile of the animal in the wall and then carved it out. So once again, it would seem magical. Like there's a reason that they saw it in the wall. Right? The last image that we have from cave painting actually isn't a cave. It isn't from a cave, and it's not a painting, but it deals with fertility as well. This is called The Woman of Willendorf. When it was found, it was actually called the Venus of Willendorf, and that was modern man assuming that she was like a Venus-like figure. And so Willendorf is in Austria, right? It's actually very small. It fits inside the hand, and it's like really only like 4.5 inches long, so it's quite small. And so based on the depiction of this small little woman, what do you think it was that they valued about this object or valued about women? Any educated guesses? More than likely, this was a fertility object, right? That little belly button is thought to be natural. So they found a rock that had a little dot, little belly button in it. And so they saw the belly button, they thought, oh, it's kind of like a fertility symbol, because of course you were connected to your mother through your umbilical cord at your belly button, right? And so this is a fertility image because she's got those large breasts, she's got large hips, and she doesn't have a face, right? Because it really wasn't important that she be a particular woman, right? She just was a fertility symbol for the people. And so it would have been an object that could have been held in the hand, intentionally small and held in the hand. Okay, I'm going to move to the next image that we have in our image set. And let's see, we still have this in cave art, but it's not particularly cave art. And so we're actually in central Mexico, and we're looking at the camelid sacrum in shape of a canine. So this is from 14,000 years ago, right? Does anyone know what a camelid is? Anyone know what a camelid is? I did not know it until I learned this image. Can anyone give me an example of a camelid?
Llamas, camels, and alpacas.
Yes, they are those pack animals. Very good. And so they basically used the sacrum of it, so a bone from a camelid, and they carved it to look like some sort of canine, so some sort of dog-like creature, right? So when you look at it, what parts of this look like a dog? And that would be part of the content and the form of this. What parts of it look like a dog? How was this bone changed to look like a dog? Write it down in your notes. How does this look like a dog?
They cut holes in the end to look like nostrils.
Okay, exactly. So they carved it, and they would have carved it with probably sharp stone. They used it to create nostrils, a snout, a mouth. That would not be natural in the bone. And then, of course, well, maybe not of course, then they also altered the bone to create the ears, right? So here's some different examples of the different camelids, right? And so this is what a camelid bone would look like, right? And how it was altered to look like it, right? So I can't see my questions anymore. I still need to get that second monitor. So thinking about what in central Mexico in 14,000 years ago, you have to think about what kind of materials would have been available to artists, right? And so they would have had only natural materials. They would have had things like rock and bone to carve, especially if they were going to do things that were three-dimensional, right? And then this is, you know, part of the form is that it's it was a fossilized animal. So it was from an extinct animal that was carved from the bone, and they probably carved it with some sort of sharp tool. In central Mexico, obsidian is very, very common. And so that's a sharp stone that's incredibly hard. It's almost like a glass sort of like structure to it. So it's possible that they used some sharp tools to carve the detail of it. Does anyone know where the sacrum is? Where's the sacred bone?
at the bottom of the spine?
Right, it's at the very bottom of the spine. And actually the sacrum, especially on the human, is one of the strongest bones that we have. The femur is probably the strongest bone that we have in our leg, but your sacrum is incredibly strong. It's one of the last bones to deteriorate. So if you buried a body and left it there for, hundreds of thousands and millions of years, that would be the one that would preserve the best. So it's incredibly strong. And it's part of like our pivot. So like we bend over there, right? It holds the structure. And then of course, when it comes to birth, right? In women in particular, it's, part of the birth channel goes through the sacrum. So it would be viewed as a very important place or important bone to even early, to early man and women. So it's part of the pelvis, and it's the place where the organs are. The female organs are in particular for animals and humans. And it's, like I said, it's one of the very strongest of bones. It can take on a lot of stress. It's very, very strong. Now, in Latin, sacrum means sacred bone. Of course, ancient Mesoamerican people had no clue of Latin, okay? But they do refer in different Mesoamerican languages as this bone being referred to as sacred and also being part of like a deity. So there is some sort of sacredness associated with this bone. It's often related to reproduction, fertility, and reincarnation, right? It would have been viewed, because of it being part of the birth channel, a portal, right? It's like a portal from the inner world of the body into the outer world. And so it could represent a spirit gate as well for like some sort of shaman or religious belief. In many cultures, the sacrum is considered to be the resurrection bone. It doesn't mean it is for ancient Mesoamericans, but once again, it's quite possible. We often see a lot of early civilizations having very similar belief systems, even though they had no real connection, right? They wouldn't have been even, importing goods from distant lands at this part. We don't know for a fact, but sometimes bones were used in mask making in different regions of Mesoamerica. So it's quite possible that the function of this as well could be a mask. But once again, that's purely speculation because we don't really know. So you can compare this canine to maybe this small little antelope, it was carved from antelope, it's a bison, but you can see how they would often in different places. So this is Europe on the left and Mesoamerica on the right, but you can see how they were still using primitive materials to make artworks. Okay, so we don't have probably a lot of time left. We got like 10 minutes, but we're gonna go ahead and focus on Unit 2 now. Is there any questions on, I shouldn't say Unit 2, but Study Guide 1? Okay, we're gonna be looking at the connections of early humans with their natural world, focusing on burial practices and objects. So when we are in class, sometimes we have reading quizzes. And so this is an example of one of those reading quizzes, but we're gonna skip that. Also, we had a holiday weekend, right? Okay, so we are moving out of the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. Does anyone know what the major difference between Paleolithic and Neolithic is?
It's like in Neolithic when they started domesticating animals and agriculture became big.
Mm-hmm. As well as living in cities, right? So I should say cities, but like towns. So we actually start to move away from hunters and gatherers. We start to see cities developed and towns develop. We start to see more like jobs being created. So there's like skilled craftspeople. So some people were farmers, some people were potters, they had, different jobs as parts of society. And they no longer kind of, lived off of meager subsistence. So we're going to be looking at number 5, which is called the ibex vessel, or the bushel with ibex motif. And we're going to do a close reading. So what I want you to do is go into your content section of your note taker, and I'd like you just to take a few moments and look at this piece of pottery. I want you to start at the bottom, and I want you to write down things that you see that are decorating it. So this is this painted. So I'm going to start here, okay, and give you kind of an example. Can you see at the very bottom of it, there is just a band. So there's like a stripe of dark paint, and then there's thin little decorations in stripes as well, right? So go ahead and go from the bottom and then list all the things you see as you move from the bottom all the way to the top. Just do it in bullets. So I'm going to give you like a minute here. So what do you see? Pay really close attention. Okay, so what are the different things that we see? So at this bottom, I already started here. We basically see stripes, right, or bands of color, right? So then what is it that we have here in this middle section? What are some things that you wrote down in your list? Brianna, give me one thing you see in this middle section here.
I said how it was like circular, like that circle thing.
Mm-hmm. So there's some sort of strange little circle thing. And if you look at it, there's like a crisscross. And then what do you think this thing in the middle is? What does that seem to be based on? Raheel, what do you think? What is this little thing in the circle? What could this be right here?
Are you talking about the arrow thing in the middle?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was something related with agriculture, maybe.
You're right. It looks kind of like a plant life, doesn't it? It's not quite wheat, but it could be some sort of like agricultural plant. Good. What the heck is this strange thing here? Anyone know what this is? Any educated guesses on what this gigantic thing is? It takes up a lot of space on the belly of this piece.
Your mouse isn't moving on my screen.
Oh, darn. I wish I bet I can do it. I can annotate this if I just stop looking at your guys' faces. Right here. This creature. Okay, that was not good. Let's try it again. You guys see the blue circle? Do you guys see the blue circle? Oh no.
I can't see it. I don't know if it's just me though.
Oh, it's because I didn't resume share. That's the problem. I paused it from what you're doing. Can you guys see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's probably why you couldn't see my cursor either. I forgot to unpause because I took attendance. So what is this thing right here?
It kind of looks like a scythe, and some plants have been cropped and already harvested while the others haven't.
Mm-hmm. So this could be crops, and then this creature-like thing is probably the ibex that they're talking about in the name. So it's like this kind of like goat-like creature. You can see it has like fur coming from its chin, and it's got these gigantic horns. Do you think these horns are realistic?
No.
No. The whole animal is what we call stylized. It's got like the essence of it. And so the triangular shapes are kind of like the hind and the front of it. It's got a tail, it's got a head, and then it's got these big giant horns, but it's not necessarily, super realistic. So it's stylized, or what we call schematic. Schematic is kind of like a symbol. So we have this stylized animal, and then we have like this kind of frame around it. This row right here, does anyone know what this is? What are these creatures?
Like dogs?
Right? They're like running dogs. They are strange. They're like wiener dogs. They've been kind of stretched out. Then we got some more horizontal bands. And then at the very top, we have something else. Can you guys tell what these are? It looks like an arrow, and then some birds. So they're birds with extremely long necks. So this has what we often call animal style, where they're using animals as decorations for the form. Right? So let me go back to mouse here. Okay. Yes, clear all my drawings. Okay. So it has horizontal bands, patterns of long necked birds. It has running dogs. It's got the long horned ibex. And then the underlined words are kind of different vocabulary that we have. This is organized in what we call registers. Registers are horizontal bands that contain decorative information as well as visual information. So the Egyptians carved and painted in registers. They would do things in rows, right? So schematic is that symbolic or simplified, and then stylized is where things are done in a non-realistic manner. So the style of prehistory as well as Neolithic is often considered to be stylized, not super realistic. It's more about getting the idea across of the ibex or the dog or the bird. And often things are stylized based on the shape of the vessel. So, this band is really large, so maybe they exaggerated the long neck of the bird. The bird probably has a long neck, but obviously not as long as you see it here, right? So a little bit about this pottery. Here's some more pieces made from this region. And by looking at it, does anyone know how these pieces were made? They have incredibly thin walls to them. They probably were either hand built or they were made on primitive pottery wheels, and then they were painted with slip. So when you see this brownish color here, that's all painted slip. And so what they do is they take the clay and some pigment, typically things like the ochres, and they mix it together and they paint this watery down clay with color on top of the surface. And these were found as part of our theme. They were found in a necropolis. So a necropolis would be a city of the dead. It would be a burial place. And the Acropolis was found on a fortified hill right next to the city. So it was kind of separated from, what happened? Uh-oh. Sorry. So they were found in an Acropolis. So we already talked about this, that these people would have been living in a city, raising crops and raising livestock. But one of the things to focus on is why these things would have been buried with the dead. Some speculation about this is that they were offerings to the dead or offerings to the gods of the dead, and they could have possibly been used to show off the wealth. And one of the reasons why we think it shows off wealth is, do you think this is the kind of vessel people would normally eat out of or drink out of? No, right? And so this would have been to show off wealth. Only people who could afford to be buried with dignity or to have potters make these pieces would have incorporated them in their tombs. Okay, we need to go because I totally took 2 minutes of your time in between your periods. I'm sorry, I need to set an alarm when I'm at home. So for tomorrow, finish up study guide 2, and then just start with the Ambum Stone for prehistory. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow.